You are listening to the Cognitive Preference Podcast, where we explore the fascinating ways in which our brains process information, make decisions, and perceive the world around us. My name is Robert Brown. I'm here with Francis Sopper, the originator of the Kairos Assessment, which is a series of questions that reveals how your brain prefers to think, listen, observe, move, read, and talk. You can take the assessment at kairoscognition.com to help you better follow along with the show. In today's episode, Frank shares some profound insights into the nature of anger, revealing that it stems from a place of fear. By recognizing this connection, we can better manage our emotions and respond more compassionately to others. You mentioned that anger is often a fear response. Can you tell me more about that?
It's going to be hard for me to think of a case when it's not a fear response. Anger is our brain's reflexive response to a threat. And in particular, a threat we don't have another reflexive or more adaptive reflexive response to managing. So what our brain is doing all day long is opportunity, threat, opportunity, threat, opportunity, threat, reacting constantly. And so when there's a threat that we have a reflexive response to, so driving a car, somebody or something is in front of you, you go into a reflexive response. And if that's well managed, you just boom, do it, no fear response. If you step on the brake and the brake isn't responding the way it customarily responds, then the fear response shows up. If something unexpected shows up, if you're driving and it's not kind of the normal, somebody's slowing down for a stoplight or somebody's slowing down because it's construction, but somebody cut you off, now you may go into the adaptive response of slamming on the brake, but the close call also activated a fear response simultaneously. And now you're angry with the person. And so it's anger is one of the stages of grief, or one of the things that show up with grief. And so grief is a response to something we find cognitively overwhelming and don't have a path out. So anger shows up when something overwhelms us cognitively and we don't have a path. And anger is the protective response. So it's whatever the threat is, it's the response to back off that threat. Or to frighten away that threat. But yeah, can you think of a time when it's not fear? When it's not generated?
No, my brain goes to certainly a defense mechanism to protect yourself from fear, vulnerability, and by expressing anger, I feel more in control. I think when I think of anger, the fight or flight response, you can either fly away or you can lean into it. And leaning into it, you feel a bit more powerful. But now, kind of knowing that this is stemming from fear, I don't know how powerful that really is now. Maybe the anger response, it brings a different meaning almost. Is there anything we can do to control that anger? Like practical steps, I guess, that you can take to diffuse that?
Yeah, it does. It does make us, the reason we go into that puffed up, aggression is to restore a feeling of power and control, that the fear is taken away from us. So it's a reflexive response to restore power and control. So this is something I've thought a lot about because I have had a lot of reflexive anger response in my life, and it goes, all of us have stuff embedded inside us, from from our earliest days. A lot of these reflexive responses got embedded in us in our infancy, early childhood, developmental stage. You've got a you've got a young one who's developing all kinds of responses right now, and those responses are still going to be. Some of them are still going to be with him when he's my age, because I'm generating responses that I learned, when I was his age. So, uh, so for lots of good reasons, I felt a very powerful need to protect myself, and so anger developed as a reflexive response. As I got older, that reflexive response, well, it may or may not have been helpful at the time, but it was all I had. Now I feel like I should have a much broader range of responses. And one of the things I've learned is that when you respond with anger, it ignites the other person's defensive response and ignites their anger. So when someone approaches you with anger, it ignites your anger response. When you respond with anger, it ignites their anger response. Now, if the two of you are responding with anger, it accelerates. And you played hockey. You've watched an anger response accelerate between two players, which then causes the two benches to erupt. And people who had no participation in the original flare up are now flailing at each other with anger, right? And all the time. And it's a very powerful reflexive response. And so now when two people are angry with each other, it it creates a suction that draws other people in. And then eventually you have it accelerates and accelerates and accelerates, and eventually you have things that are called World War II. As because there's no sometimes there's no natural stopping place to that anger response, um, and um, and that uh, and that actually. Yeah, Europe had what was called the Hundred Years' War. It was anger response that generated into war that never got resolved. People got tired of it for periods of time and kind of backed off from it. But as soon as they got their energy and resources back, went back into it. There's no natural stopping point to that. But one of the things that I've found is when somebody approaches me with anger and uh, and I just look at them calmly, that knocks them back because their reflexive response to anger, the expectation is it's supposed to back me off with fear. And when I don't get backed off with fear, when I'm just stay calm and uh, and uh, hold my ground, but don't look at them hostilely, don't return insult or don't return threat, it slows the cycle down. Because what your brain thinks, this person is calm, does that make him less dangerous or more dangerous? If somebody is calm in response to my threat didn't do what I hoped it would do. And so it disrupts the circuit in the brain and slows it down, because the counter response of anger just throws more fuel on it. And then they throw fuel back on yours, and you throw back on yours, and the next thing you know, all of your friends and allies are fighting, and next thing you know, it's a global battle of whose friends, all of your friends, your half of the world are your friends, and the other half of the world are their friends, are now fighting. And we're kind of looking at that right now. People are choosing up sides right now, and a lot of close observers are thinking that, yeah, we're in the early stages of World War III because of this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And in order to interrupt that, we have to go into a counterintuitive response. Our reflexive response is anger. The counterintuitive response is to stay calm and treat it as something interesting. This is actually what martial arts tries to teach you, what most spiritual traditions try to teach you. King Solomon was considered the wisest person of his time, said, a soft word turns away wrath. Because what happens is we're going opportunity, threat, opportunity, threat, opportunity, threat. What if we get to a point of psychological awareness where everything is just another opportunity? What appears to be a threat is just a problem to solve. So somebody comes to me with anger, is angry with me. Huh, how do I solve this problem? If I can feel, if I can get to a place where I don't perceive it as a threat, but perceive it as a problem to solve, then I can start to negotiate with the person. And this is actually what's happened now in hostage negotiation. I think I've talked about this before. The hostage negotiator doesn't counter-threaten the person who's holding a hostage. The hostage negotiator, how can we solve this problem? How can we get, you're in something here. You've got yourself into something. How can we get you out of it? And what you're doing is the fear is fear of death, fear of deprivation, fear of disrespect. So what you've got to do to back somebody out of it is first of all start with respect. Then what do they need? And how do you help them feel safe? And so you back your way, start with respect, then what do you need? And then how can we make you feel safe? How can you get out of this situation alive now? That's exactly what a hostage negotiator is saying. And then that's what people who are going in to negotiate a war, the end of a war, are trying to do. Start with respect. Then what do you need? And how can, as we unwind this, how can we keep everybody safe? So the first thing that has to show up if you're negotiating the end of a war is respect. You have to treat your enemies respectfully. And that's when you go in, flag of truce, sit down, we're going to talk to each other, human to human, and you've got to put aside all of the anger, all of the hurt, all of the tragedy that you've all experienced, all of the loss that you've all experienced, and go, okay, we're going to start with respect.
That's also counterintuitive.
That's how every war ends.
Right. Just doesn't seem rational. But you talked about that in your recent newsletter. You're talking about Peter Galbraith's experience with negotiating and highlighting the importance of convincing people that they're really better off negotiating rather than continuing this conflict. How can we actually encourage that resolution?
Well, it's interesting that you're referencing Peter Galbraith. Ambassador Galbraith, although in our region he was also State Senator Galbraith, was part of the negotiation for the end of the Bosnian Serbian conflict in Central Europe. The conflict took place in the Balkans, which is it's called the Balkans. It's that area just north of Turkey and Greece, comes up against Russia, comes up against Poland, and it's a complex area. And it's multi-ethnic, multi-religious. So it's Muslim, Greek and Russian Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant in there too. And the various different ethnicities also have ethnic identities, but also religious identities. And everybody's tightly packed into a relatively small area. And it's been a region of conflict and volatility almost forever. And it's very hard to unpack with all those interlocking identities. That's where World War I started. So what they had to do was recognize everybody had needs and wants, and everybody needed how do we feel safe? Ultimately, how do we feel safe? And they had to go into negotiations with people they loathed. And you had to go in, and people they distrusted. They both loathed and distrusted. And they had to develop some respect. Yeah, at least sit around the table with people and be open to a possibility. I grew up, playing a lot of games in the street and, just self-organized games in the street. And they'd often devolve into conflict. And if a big brother or big sister walked by, someone who's enough older than you all to look at you and say, knock it off. That often was enough to resolve the conflict.
Convincing enough. Yeah.
Yeah. And obviously if a parent showed up or some other adult showed up, but often it just kind of took an older sibling often just to say, knock it off. Because nobody really wanted to be fighting. They wanted what they wanted, but they didn't really want to be fighting. The U.S. and European powers came in as those older siblings to that conflict. And so they were able to sit there with that calm. And that calm can be contagious. Now, if you read Galbraith's account of that, I'm making it sound a whole lot easier than it was. And there was a whole lot of back and forth. And there's an interesting case he makes, and one has to be very careful with this one. But sometimes you actually have to have a controlled show of force to let people know that you can't be pushed around. Because in a conflict like that, people will, try to gain advantage and bully and threaten.
Right.
And,
Try to get the upper hand as
yeah,
quickly as possible.
right. So in this case, the show of force was U.S. fighter jets, and um, but it was actually something I learned from my grandfather. He said, if you're attacked by a gang of bullies, which was, again, a thing that happened, you identify the leader, often the biggest, but not always. But you identify the leader and you punch him in the nose. Now, that can very easily turn into a brawl where you end up getting yourself knocked to the ground and kicked until you're really sorry you did that. But my experience, and I'm talking from real life experience, I've only ever had to walk up to the leader and say, with complete calm, which I got from my grandfather, and say, this is how this is going to go down. And that was always enough to back it off. Because who is this guy? We can clearly take this guy down and kick him till he's dead. But he's not afraid of us. And it always diffused it. I can't say it always will, can't say it always does, but approaching the threat with calm is disarming. Now, I was ready to take that poke also, but I was going to do it calmly as a problem to be solved and not as a fear response.
Right. Right. Because the fear response is the anger.
Right. And so the
And
anger would have just thrown fuel on the anger of those 4 or 5 people. And yeah, then
and now you're back to the suction. Now you've got everybody joining in on this.
got to join in. And since I had
This
no
way.
allies, I was going to go away at best with a couple of broken ribs. Yeah.
Does the same level of fear show up for the associative and sequential?
If we're associative or sequential, we use both. So I'm right-handed, but I'm going into a fight with both hands. And I might even lead with my left because that might surprise somebody. So, so we're not stuck in that response, but yeah, the same level of fear and anger response is going to show up in someone either associative sequential, and it shows up reflexively. And then what your move is, your next move is, will depend on your for the associative on the context and experience. So you're going to be drawing off your experience in this situation. The the person who's sequential is what processes do I have? for moving through a situation like this.
And so in your case of this bully, your grandfather had the experience. He shared that experience with you, and that was your way of making the decision of these emotional responses that stem from fear.
Yeah, I was able to put aside the emotional response and turn it into a problem to be solved. And I had some training and learning of how to solve a complex problem like this. And in some ways, it was kind of sequential. You break it down into I broke down the thread into its component parts. And so look around, okay, here's the leader of this thread. And now I'm going to target the leader. So it actually was, even though I'm definitely more strongly associative, the experience and training I got allowed me to not react immediately, reflexively. So the context and experience that I learned, but the actual approach was a sequential approach, is to break down, now that I'm dealing with this as a problem to be solved and not as a fear threat. Like, okay, step one is, step two is, step three is. So I didn't just go into it random. I didn't go into that group randomly. I broke the group down. Now, Galbraith did this on a global scale. He was you bring in these negotiators who aren't or don't live in the region, haven't had their houses bombed, haven't had their friends and families killed, and so they can go in more likely to have a sense of calm. And Galbraith made a decision that one of the parties they actually needed to punch him in the nose because that party didn't believe they thought the negotiators would back down.
Okay, well, thank you for your time today, Frank, and everybody listening into the show. If you do find value in these episodes, please consider sharing it with your friends, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.